The public's collective imagination is always ignited by the assassination of a royal. Whether beheaded in front of a roaring crowd or stabbed in the back by political allies, the motivations and machinations of royal assassinations have been among the most striking and transformative events in history. From the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BC to the execution of the Romanovs in 1918, royal assassinations have been the start of political turmoil, scandal, and even war. Regicide, the act of killing a sovereign, has been around almost as long as there have been kings, queens, and royal families. Born during the tumultuous War of the Roses, the sons of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were plunged into political uncertainty after the death of their father, Edward IV, in 1483. The monarch's brother, the Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, became Lord Protector of his 12-year-old nephew and heir, Edward V. In the same year, the Duke lodged his nephews in the Tower of London, supposedly to protect them. But the two boys were never seen again. Everyone suspected that they had been murdered. Years later, Shakespeare ended up immortalizing Richard III as a murderous villain. In 1674, a group of laborers discovered the skeletons of two boys of the same age in a wooden chest under the stairs of the White Tower. However, there is no proof that the bones in the tower belonged to the ill-fated princes. Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie of Bavaria, better known by her childhood name, Sisi, was Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. The young noblewoman's eventful public life began at the age of 16, when she married Franz Joseph of Austria, monarch of one of Europe's largest empires. The marriage initially seemed like a dream, but the court's strict rules turned the empress's life into a living hell. She would later tell and write about feeling trapped and dissatisfied with life. Empress Elizabeth of Austria was famous for her beauty and desire to stay out of the limelight. Disliking pomp and circumstance, she traveled under a pseudonym under a stay in Geneva, Switzerland. But news of her visit spread quickly after someone at the hotel revealed her identity. On September 10, 1898, Elizabeth took a walk without an entourage to board a steamer bound for Montreux. It was there that the 25-year-old Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini approached Elizabeth and her lady-in-waiting, stabbing the empress with a 10-centimeter-long file. Although Elizabeth's tight corset slowed the bleeding, she died. Shock and grief fell over Vienna. In her own words, Sisi described her life in writing, "I loved, I lived, I wandered the world, but I never achieved what I sought." Franz Ferdinand, Sisi's nephew, was also assassinated. Probably the most impactful royal assassination in history was the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew of Franz Joseph, and heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a melting pot of multiple ethnic and national groups. To the vexation of neighboring Serbia, Bosnia had been annexed by the empire in 1908. When Franz Ferdinand visited the Bosnian city of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, tension was high. Traveling in an open car with his wife Sophie, the Archduke was approached by 19-year-old Slavic nationalist Gavrilo Princip, who shot the couple dead. The murders triggered the First World War. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, which brought Germany, Russia, France, and Britain into the conflict due to the web of alliances between these nations. The rest is history. Henry IV of Bourbon was born on December 13, 1553. He was France's first Bourbon king, also becoming King of Navarre as Henry III. The Protestant Henry IV struggled to ascend the throne. In 1572, with the death of his mother, the Queen of Navarre, and his brother in 1584, Henry became the legal heir to the royal throne. To this day, he is remembered as an extremely popular king. In addition, his name is still present at 11 Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris, where a plaque with a fleur-de-lis has been laid in the ground. It marks the spot where the fanatical monk François Ravaillac assassinated the monarch on May 14, 1610. Angered by the promulgation of the Edict of Nantes, which granted religious freedom to French Protestants, the regicide stabbed the monarch in his carriage during a public appearance in Paris. Henry IV's remains were buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, in a tomb shared with other French monarchs. After 2 centuries later, the site was ravaged by revolutionaries. Many skeletons went missing, were incomplete, and difficult to identify after the 1793 raid. And we are still in France, as the monarch before Henry IV, In this case, Henry III was also murdered. There is a huge contrast between the way historians treated the two great political assassinations of French history. That of the first Bourbon king, Henry IV in 1610, was the subject of an impactful political legend that dominated the rest of the ancient regime. The reactions to his murder were enough to stir up monarchist sentiments in early Bourbon France. Absolutist notions concerning the king's divine protection and royalty as a sacred office accountable only to God became imperative to protect a future king from the sacrilege of regicide. But in the case of Henry III, regicide seems to have been a blessing. Henry III was the favorite son of the controversial Catherine de' Medici. The boy was even a suitor of Elizabeth I, but the engagement did not come to fruition. He actually liked to dress up as a woman and create fashionable trends at court. He also took part in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and his reign was very unpopular. In the last years of his life, he angered the ultra-Catholics by allying himself with the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV. On July 31, 1589, the friar Jacques Clement was spotted on a road heading towards the king's headquarters in Paris. He was stopped. When asked what he wanted, the monk reported that he had a message of significant importance for His Majesty. In reality, the Dominican friar was a loner suffering from hallucinations, believing he heard the voice of God and had received instructions from the Almighty to kill the king. Henry agreed to see him the next day at 8 in the morning. The guards went to fetch the monk for his audience with the king. Inexplicably, they did not frisk the assassin before he could meet the king. Clement kissed the monarch's hand and handed him letters. Henry insisted that he come closer and tell him about the news in his ear. Clement bent low, as if picking up the mail, but his hand concealed a knife, which he plunged into the king's lower abdomen, up to the handle. Still on his feet, the king cried, "Ah, my God, the bastard has stabbed me." He yanked the knife from his stomach and punched Clement twice in the face, while the guard stabbed the assassin, throwing the regicide's body out of the window. Bleeding profusely, Henry stood with the assassin's knife in one hand and his intestines in the other. The doctors who attended him seemed optimistic, reinserted the intestines, and bandaged the king. Realizing that he would not have long to live, the king requested last rites. He died at 4 in the morning on August 2nd, due to intestinal perforation and severe internal bleeding. Catherine's favorite son was not the only one to come to an end, but also the Valois dynasty.